Well, let's return now to South Africa, where a Pretoria court has heard the 11th day of testimony in the Oscar Pistorius trial. Well, today, firearms specialist Sean Renz testified that the Olympian track star knew the rules on gun use and that he knew how to deal with intruders. Pistorius admits he killed his girlfriend Viva Steenkamp on Valentine's Day last year, but says he killed her by accident, thinking she was an intruder. Well, for more on today's revelations, we can now go live to Pretoria and our legal analyst, Brenda Wardle. How bad a day was it for Oscar Pistorius?
Good evening, Heather. It was a very, very bad day for Oscar Pistorius and the defense. Even after lunch, when Advocate Barry Roux had to cross-examine Warrant Officer van Staden, the state photographer, who stood firm, you could see that he asked for 5-minute breaks, wanting this, and van Staden absolutely unrelenting. So it was, I think, the most brutal day for the defense was actually today.
Indeed, because last week Barry Roux had a field day with the police who he accused of contaminating the crime scene. Today, though, we had a police photographer who seemed to negate that.
Well, perhaps not totally negate the fact that the crime scene was tampered with, but as far as his own responsibilities went, him taking the photographs, the sequence followed, absolutely nothing could be discredited in his testimony. Obviously, it's a totally different case for the Vermeulens, for people like Hilton Botha, whom I doubt the state is going to call, but Warrant Officer van Staden, definitely credible witness and who actually followed the rules and regulations to the T.
Well, speaking of the rules and regulations and the evidence from Mr. Renz about that Oscar did know about the protocols when using his gun. Now, the only people who knew what happened that night were Oscar and Riva. And what we've got is circumstantial evidence. How is anybody going to prove their case?
Well, with circumstantial evidence, the rules that are followed are those which were set out in Rex versus Blom, which dealt with a conviction based on circumstantial evidence, and all that the appellate division then, which is the Supreme Court of Appeal, now requires is that the court must draw an inference from the totality of the evidence which is available, having a look at the objective facts, and if that is the only inference that can be drawn to the exclusion of all other inferences, then the state would have discharged their onus and proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. And I think Gerinel dealt a massive blow to the defense by that, and he would, just based on the evidence of that witness earlier this morning, Renz, and if you look at what was said by Samantha Taylor previously, that when Oscar was perturbed one evening during a storm, he actually asked her if she had heard the noise. The example that we heard in court this morning, that at some stage, I think his washing machine or tumble dryer made a noise, he went down armed, but he did not discharge his firearm. So his defense that, you know, in his plea he says it's putative self-defense. Yes, he admits unlawfulness. Yes, he did kill someone. He admits that, but that he didn't have the intention. I think with the witness we had today, that is totally out of the water. Oscar knew what he was doing on that fateful morning of February 14.
What do you think his defense lawyer, Barry Roux, is thinking tonight, and how do you think he's going to present himself in court tomorrow?
I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow because he's given some homework to Warrant Officer van Staden to bring him the photographs and everything that he asked for. Van Staden basically said, oh, yes, indeed. I mean, with a common court courtesy, he ought to have asked the state advocate, Gerinel, for access to those, but he directly addressed the witness, definitely having a terrible day, and I'm sure they are huddled together discussing their options as we speak. I also doubt whether Oscar Pistorius will actually take the stand, because if we've had a look at his emotional reaction to some of the graphic images in court, I don't know how he would hold up. So my suspicion is that at the end of the state's case, they'll try and invoke Section 174, and if that happens, I do not think Oscar will take the stand.
Very interesting. Brenda Wardle, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Let's go to Pretoria to speak to our legal analyst, Brenda Wardle. Brenda, what would happen if Pistorius doesn't take the stand?
Good evening, Heather. Well, if Pistorius doesn't take the stand, we have a leading authority in South Africa, which was the state versus Alan Bussack. If you remember, he was the reverend who was a freedom fighter from the United Democratic Front. And he was essentially, firstly, he did not take the stand because he argued that he has a right to remain silent and a right not to testify. And then he didn't take the stand, and there was an invoice that was submitted in court. And when they submitted the invoice in court, his counsel from the bar basically said, well, we'll allow this invoice to be taken in, but our silence shouldn't be construed as consent. Now, he was convicted and sentenced, and he appealed to the Supreme Court of Appeal. And the Supreme Court of Appeal basically said, when the prosecution, because South Africa follows a discretionary prosecutorial model, when the prosecution decides that there is a prima facie case against an accused person, and they go against that, and the accused does nothing to disturb the state's case, prima facie proof hardens to proof beyond reasonable doubt. And again, then the reliance is placed upon the decision of Rex versus Blom. Now, Alan Bussack took it further than the Supreme Court of Appeal, went to the Constitutional Court, arguing that his rights in the Constitution, Section 35, 3H of the Constitution, where he does have a right to remain silent, meant that his guilt had not been proven beyond reasonable doubt. And the Constitutional Court was categoric. They dismissed that and said if they were to entertain that appeal, then all criminal matters would be appeals. So if Oscar Pistorius doesn't take the case, take the stand, and he doesn't rebut critical evidence from the state, as the evidence that we heard from Sean Renz yesterday, he stands a real chance of being convicted.
Now, are the police bungles, though, sufficient to ensure a mistrial and a discharge of Oscar?
Now, I doubt that we could actually see a discharge. I could see that Advocate Barry Rue is going in the direction of the procedural issues, because the right to a fair trial has got two legs: the substantive fairness, which deals with the crime and any potential defense that an accused person might have, but also the procedural aspects, the investigation of the crime itself, the prosecution of the accused, the leading of evidence in court. And that is what Barry Rue is actually concentrating on. Today he spent a whole lot of time, after we commenced at about 11:15 with Warrant Officer van Staden, basically putting to Warrant Officer van Staden that Colonel Mutwa, who is the commander or the senior of Warrant Officer van Staden, had tampered and touched the firearm with his bare hands, etc. But that just makes a mockery, and in the end what we should ask is, who stands to benefit from the police bungling the case deliberately, as it seems now? Senior ranking police officers, and obviously that would rebound in Oscar's favor. But I'm sure that the state is fully aware of that, and no doubt the judge, as well as her assessors, as the trier of fact, and the assessor as the people who are there to assess the facts, would actually be able to pick that up from the evidence that is emerging.
Now, you talk about the messing up of the crime scene. Do you think it's incompetence, or do you think it's more sinister than that?
Excuse me, I didn't hear that, Heather.
You talk about the messing up of the crime scene. Do you think it's incompetence,
Yes.
or do you think it's more sinister than that?
No, it's more sinister than that. You cannot have, I mean, if a warrant officer in the police force knows the correct procedure, why would a colonel at that senior level not know the procedure to be followed? And it was amazing that Warrant Officer van Staden told Advocate Barry Roux that, look, I had to ask Colonel Mutwa to leave the crime scene because he was tampering with the evidence.
Brenda, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Back to the Pistorius murder case now, and as we heard earlier, the trial has been adjourned now until Monday. Brenda Wardle is there for us to analyse the week in court. Now, Brenda, at the end of the first 13 days of the trial, given that the evidence we've heard, how does it affect Oscar's plea of self-defence that he has given the evidence we've heard?
Good evening, Heather. I think that the defence, that putative self-defence has been blown right out of the water by Rens, by Professor Simon, and today by Captain Mangena, and also in addition by the witnesses who heard the gunshots, then screaming, then further gunshots, and screaming fading away thereafter. But those, I think, Gerinel still needs to tidy up those. But Professor Simon, Captain Mangena, all those basically just, and Mr. Rens, those threw his defense right out of the water, and it wasn't even rebutted by the defense.
What question marks remain?
Well, Heather, the question marks that remain are the bullet hole that is in Oscar Pistorius's main bedroom wall, the stainless steel plate which is in the bathroom with a severe indentation that the forensic expert said must have been hit with a heavy object, no object found, what Oscar Pistorius was doing upstairs on 2 occasions while Dr. Stipp was downstairs, and the damage to the door itself, because those would be indicative of fighting. But nobody can put that to any witness because the defense is not offering any arguments. They're not putting that to any of the witnesses, so that is basically left hanging. For example, how many people actually called Netcare 911? Oscar says, I called Netcare 911. I asked Mr. Stander to call 911. Stander asked Peter Barber to call 911. He told Dr. Stipp he hadn't called 911. So it's still confusing, and I see there is a list, witness, from Netcare on the list, and hopefully the last 5 witnesses left, Gerinel will also tie that up by bringing in that witness.
How important is Captain Mangena's testimony of Riva's position behind the door?
Well, that testimony was important, and it basically corroborates with the testimony of Professor Simon, that the first bullet, he says he could tell with great probability which bullet was the first to pierce her, because, you know, we know that the shot to the head would have been the most debilitating, and also agreeing with Professor Simon, because Professor Simon actually demonstrated to court that Riva could not have been standing in an anatomical position, which is facing forward with the hands on the side. The trajectory of that bullet was such that it entered the right frontal parietal area at a slant, so she must have been hiding. But as for Captain Mangena, he says that the first shot was the one to the hip, which basically caused her to fall down.
Do you think Oscar's going to take the stand next week?
Well, I don't know. I really don't know whether he's going to take the stand. Obviously, in our criminal justice system, we have Section 174 of the Criminal Procedure Act, which is where the court, either meru mutu or after application by the defense, has an opportunity to discharge the accused if they feel there is no case for him to answer. But if Oscar Pistorius takes the stand, the question one needs to ask is, if he is asked to page through the albums, to have a look at the images of River, to have a look at the images of the crime scenes. We've seen him puking and retching, etc., crying, blotting out his ears. So I don't know how well he would do if he is placed under cross-examination.
Brenda Wardle, live in Pretoria. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.